Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Has Russia been meddling in UK politics? According to an official report, the answer is maybe, kinda, and the usual highly likely. The report is a dud. Also, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is on a crusade against China. Does anyone outside the Beltway really care? Cross-talking this and more, I'm joined by my guest in London, Marcus Papadopoulos. He's editor-in-chief of Politics First magazine. And we cross to Alexander Mercouris. He's a writer on legal affairs as well as editor-in-chief of theduran.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to Marcus in London. Marcus, I read the Russia report, and I couldn't help but get the feeling that it was kind of a cross-section of a BuzzFeed story and a Madison Avenue marketing proposal. Really kind of short on facts, high on accusations, and evidence-free. That's my conclusion. Go ahead, Marcus.
I approach allegations, Peter, in a judicial way and in a way that a proper court of law would approach allegations, in that I expect, demand, in fact, evidence to support accusations. And if the evidence is not there, if the evidence is not forthcoming, then the case should be dismissed. Now, as a member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, I made sure that I quickly acquired a copy of what has become known in Britain as the Russia report. And I will say this, Peter, at first glance, I was extremely dubious, because allegations of the nature which have been made by this Committee of Parliament against Russia should really manifest itself in at least 100 pages. But the report was only 20 pages. That is a very strange event. Secondly, the report is full of traditional language of British officialdom, language such as the UK is committed to the rule of law, the UK is committed to upholding the international law-based system. The language of British officialdom, Peter, has for centuries deceived a great many people, both in Britain and abroad. Now, turning to the contents, there was no evidence whatsoever put forward to support the accusations against Russia. Indeed, in two separate paragraphs, it clearly stated there is no evidence to support that Russia interfered in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. And in the second paragraph, it clearly stated that there is no evidence that Russia interfered in the 2019 general election in Britain. On that basis, Peter, there is no case to be heard, because there is no evidence corroborating these assertions against Russia. What we have seen in this report is part and parcel of a very well orchestrated and a very ruthless media, PR, and political campaign against Russia, because the Russia of today is not the Russia of the 1990s. The Russia of today is a Russia that has resurrected much of its Soviet-era superpower status, and that is what is behind this report. That is what is behind the fear of Britain and America.
Alexander Mercouris, one of the things we find very curious about it is that it essentially is demanding people like ourselves and our viewers to prove a negative, because they make a claim and they try to build a case to satisfy that claim, but they obviously don't. And they turn around and say, you have to prove to us that they didn't meddle. This is inverting the entire, well, it's inverted logically, and actually how you approach the law in any kind of meaningful and honest investigation. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, this is exactly the point, because instead of saying, we have all this evidence that there is Russian meddling in our politics, and, setting out what the evidence is and coming to conclusions. What they're saying is there is no evidence of Russian meddling in our politics. That must mean that the intelligence services are not doing their job properly, because even though there is no evidence, that, we expect them to find it. I mean, and then, as you absolutely rightly say, they then come back very aggressively to people like us, and indeed to, dare I say it, the Russian government, and say, well, we've got no evidence that you actually did meddle, so prove to us that you didn't. Marcus was talking about doing it, a judicial approach. This is the opposite of a judicial approach. It's the world turned on its head. It says, we make this assertion. We bring in all these extraordinary, dubious witnesses, people like William Browder, Christopher Steele, people, who have their own well-known views about Russia. We don't look beyond them. We don't even call in academics, for example, from British universities, people who, we know we've had them on our program. We don't look for them. We have this preconceived notion. We make an assertion. It's not an assertion, not an assertion of fact, but an assertion of belief, and then demand that the other person, the other side, proves us wrong. I mean, it's Alice in Wonderland stuff.
You mentioned something. I want to kind of go deeper on it now. Marcus here, the expert external witnesses here. I'm reading from the report here: Anne Applebaum, William Browder, Christopher Donnelly, Ed Lucas, and Christopher Steele. I mean, it's to the point of being ludicrous. I mean, all of these people have a right to their opinion, but this is the external witnesses, they're experts here of one side of this debate, if it's even a debate, because it's one empty accusation here. But I mean, shouldn't the writers of this report be embarrassed by this? I mean, anyone that watches Russia affairs, irrespective of how you feel about it, everyone would come to the conclusion, this is really one-sided. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, Peter, if Britain had a free and independent media, then its journalists, both broadcast and print ones, would highlight to the British public that these experts, and I use the word in a very loose way, in inverted commas, these experts on Russia are not objective individuals when it comes to Russian matters. Why? Because for many years now, they have demonstrated hostility towards Russia. They have demonstrated hostility towards the Russian government, hostility towards Russian foreign policy. So they are not objective experts, and they are certainly not impartial. But once again, what we see in Britain is another example, another manifestation where British politicians feel emboldened to make accusations of any kind whatsoever against Russia, knowing that they do not have to put forward evidence to support those assertions. Because British mainstream media will not question. They will certainly not ask penetrating questions. They will not scrutinize. Why? Because media standards in Britain and also in America, Peter, have collapsed. That is why British politicians feel they can make any claim against Russia, because they know that British mainstream media is not going to scrutinize what they are saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no downside in being wrong here, ever. Okay, Alexander McCure's, I'm going to make a supposition here. Of course, this is hostility towards Russia, and this has to do to bolster NATO, to bolster defense spending in the UK and in the United States. I mean, the necessity of an enemy. But there's a corollary to all of this, and I think it's even more insidious, because the agenda that I just mentioned, that's going to go on anyway. Okay, we'll talk about China later in the program here. But this is really a pitch for censorship, and it's a pitch for the security forces to control free speech, to decide what is acceptable speech. And of course, the third point here, this is directed right at us, here at RT. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, absolutely. I mean, first about those experts. I mean, this is a tiny group of experts. An impartial investigation would call for many, many more experts than this, and experts with a diverse backgrounds and diverse views. These people were chosen because they are known to have the views about Russia that they do. But you're quite right. The only actual evidence, and I don't call it evidence, I mean, I use the word evidence in inverted commas, the only actual points that are made about Russian broadcasters, about RT and about Sputnik. And of course, what do we see? We see a campaign against these broadcasters afterwards. And who pursues these? Interestingly enough, the leader of the British Labour Party, coming back to Marcus's point, who is, of course, a lawyer. He must know when he reads this how absurd it is.
So charitable. I would call him a tool of the security force.
But he has a legal training. He has a legal training. He must see when he reads this report that it's fact-free, that it's the experts behind it are not, from a representative pool of Russian experts, not remotely. And yet he is campaigning now for RT, for action to be taken against RT. And you're absolutely right. It isn't just Russian broadcasters, but it's voices, dissident voices within Britain itself.
It's really interesting because there is such a thing as Ofcom, and it's not supposed to be partisan here. Now, what we're hearing now from the Labour Party is that it should be partisan. The government should get involved and decide what is good speech, safe speech, security speech for the public sphere in Britain. I mean, this is going over the line. I mean, I have my issues with Ofcom, but and now they're going to be shoved aside, and the government's going to decide what you can say and what you can hear, what broadcast. Marcus, let me pitch that to you.
Well, Peter, for many years now, Ofcom has been the British government or the British establishment's unofficial censorship agency. So there is not much to learn from what Ofcom says. But in regard to the Labour Party, let me tell you this. The Conservative Party is the party of the British establishment. But the Labour Party has long been an opposition party controlled by the British establishment. Indeed, Soviet diplomats in the 1940s and the 1950s used to report back to Moscow that the Labour Party is not a genuine socialist party. It is a party controlled by the establishment. Now and again, the party is led by socialists, and those socialists have to be derailed. For example, Michael Foot, and in recent times, Jeremy Corbyn. But as far as the British establishment is concerned, now that Keir Starmer is heading the Labour Party, in their eyes, is back in safe hands.
Okay. Well, I really wish that report had delved into the Russian oligarchs living in the UK and how they use their money for political influence. But I suppose that'll come out in volume 2. All right, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, let's go back to London. Alexander Mercouris. Mike Pompeo has been very bombastic, I would say, in the last few days here. He's taken a swing at Nord Stream, and also he's come out very loudly about China here. And let me quote you something he said here. It's really quite interesting to me. China ripped off our prized intellectual property and trade secrets, costing millions of jobs across America. Really, China did that? I thought American corporations did that. Maybe I got this wrong. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, first of all, you're right about this. I mean, it was American corporations who decided to send their factories to China, not just to China, by the way, to Mexico, to Indonesia, to all kinds of places that's supposed to be, you know, their business decisions. America is the land of free enterprise, after all. That's the idea anyway. But seriously, I found Pompeo's speech extremely troubling and very, very concerning. I mean, it's unbelievably aggressive in its language. It paints a picture of China which is so dark. I mean, I'm not going to say that I don't recognize. I'm just.
It should be familiar. It should be familiar, though.
Oh, I know. Well, quite. But I mean, it's clearly leading into not just a sort of divorce between China and the US. It's clearly more than just jobs and issues of that kind. That's a demagogic aspect of this speech intended to rally American public opinion. It's clearly looking for a long-term confrontation with China, which is now being represented as basically the new Soviet Union. So we're back into all of that all over again. It's Cold War II with a vengeance. And I have to say, I think a lot of people in Europe especially will be looking at this and they will be, you know, shaking their heads and sighing and saying to themselves, oh no, not again. Because this is what it is.
Union's biggest trading partner is China. Let's remember that there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Germany's biggest trading partner is China. And this is what it's all about now. And of course, you have these demagogic statements about China stealing our jobs, which of course they didn't do. China's stealing our technology. The Chinese can't come up with their own technology. That's why they're ahead, of course. I mean, they're ahead with, you know, Huawei is ahead on 5G, not because the Chinese are better, but because...
We have to point out that in many cases, when Western companies wanted to do business in China, is that they sign a waiver to a lot of their technologies. I mean, it's not as if does industrial espionage happen? Of course it happens. Everybody does it, okay? Yes. I mean, all of a sudden, Mike Pompeo thinks it's only one country in the world that does it. Everybody does it. That's part that's part of doing business here. Let me go to Marcus here. Marcus, one of the things that also he said, says that the world must change China or China will change us. Well, that's kind of interesting there. That's kind of a form of Orientalism, if I've ever heard any. Go ahead.
And I would add to that, Peter, that is a form of passive aggression. And that is something that, of course, the world should be very, very alarmed by. But I suspect, Peter, that I have a dissenting voice in all of this. Yes, on the one hand, there is clearly growing tension between Washington and Beijing. That manifests itself partly in American military maneuvers in the South China Sea and also the trade war. But on the other hand, I submit that it is not in the interests for either America or China for there to be a further and major serious deterioration in the relationship between the two countries. Because if the economic relationship between the Americans and the Chinese was to collapse, if it was to be severed, then both countries almost overnight would go into recession. The China's project, the One Belt, yes, that has very, very large ambitions, and I have no doubt it will accrue a great amount of money for the Chinese, but it will not compare to the trading and investment relationship that the Chinese have with America. And I would also say this, there are a lot of commentators who are talking about Chinese military might and how the Chinese could deter the Americans in the South China Sea. Well, yes, the Chinese military will certainly fight anyone in the world to defend Chinese national security. But the People's Liberation Army remains the largest armed forces museum in the world. The Chinese have progressed when it comes to technological matters, and they have done exceedingly well, but they are still dependent on Russia for high technology, for a lot of their air defense systems, and also for their fifth generation aircraft. If China was to become embroiled in a war with Taiwan, you would see the difficulties the Chinese would encounter in fighting a very advanced military that Taiwan has. So you cannot compare the Chinese military to the American military.
I don't think we're there yet. And I'd like to go back to a point you made a minute ago. Let me go to Alexander McCuris. I mean, it's the United States that's threatening trade. It's not really the Beijing doing it. I mean, the way it's being played out now, it's an either or. It's the China world or it's the West, the Washington consensus. I mean, and it's being pushed in that direction. And at this point, it's a very dangerous game of chicken. But I don't think anyone wants a real confrontation here. But what's happening here, and let's go back to Mike Pompeo, he's with us or them. That's where we are in this struggle right now. Alexander McCuris.
Well, this is exactly true, because I take all the points that Marcus says, and you're absolutely right, Peter. If you read the Chinese media, or at least the Chinese English language media, they are horrified by these events. They're not looking for a fight with the United States. They're not looking to sever the economic relationship with the United States. All the points that Marcus is making about this being a tremendous own goal for both the United States and China if they move to an adversarial, a hostile world, the Chinese themselves are making. They're making them quite openly. But the fact is, you are discussing this in a rational way, and there is not much rationality in Mike Pompeo's speech. There's not much rationality in US policy about China at the moment. And other countries that look to these things in a more rational way, the Europeans, the Southeast Asians, countries like Taiwan, countries like the Philippines, they're looking at all of this and they're being asked to take sides in exactly the way that you say, and they don't like it. They don't want it at all. But that is the world that people like Mike Pompeo, and it must be said, a lot of other people in the United States are dragooning us into. Now, unless we stop them, but at the moment there isn't much pushback to stop them.
It's very messianic and apocalyptic, this kind of language, which is completely counterproductive. Marcus, Pompeo also said Beijing has taken selfish advantage of U.S. and Western generosity. What world is he living in?
Well, this is the same individual, Peter, who once said openly that the CIA has overthrown foreign governments. Now, when Pompeo, or indeed other Western politicians, talk about generosity, well, I suppose generosity has been defined in their own terms. I don't think the Chinese would find it generous how the Americans and the British, or the special services of America and Britain, have interfered in Hong Kong and have orchestrated and have provided assistance to the militant protesters in Hong Kong. I don't think the Chinese, or indeed any other country in the world, would find it generous that the Americans have started redeploying elements of ISIS to the Xinjiang province, which is a restless Muslim province in the westernmost part of China. So, how on earth can Mike Pompeo make the assertion that America, or the West in general, has been generous? But then it takes me back to my point, which I made earlier on in this episode. Mike Pompeo is simply one Western politician who knows there is not going to be scrutiny with his comments when it comes to Russia or when it comes to China, because American mainstream media are simply a tool of the American establishment, and therefore they are not going to question him when it comes to China, because American mainstream media is neither free nor independent. They are used as a weapon, and I would say, Peter, they are the most potent weapon that the West has in its arsenal to attack countries in the world which pursue independent foreign policies.
Alexander McCuris, it's a very interesting confluence of events right now. We have the upcoming American presidential election. Donald Trump is way down in the polls. It appears, I think, that there's a growing consensus that his greatest weakness was his reaction to the corona virus plague. Of course, his administration is pointing all of the blame at China. The V recovery is not in the cards, or at least for the majority of people here. China just is a very convenient card to play right now, I would say, and it's convenient because there's no pushback, as Marcus was saying, but it's extremely dangerous because the interconnection, the coupling of the American economy to the China's economy is so very, very deep and intense. Nothing like it ever was with Russia, for example. Go ahead.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, the atmosphere in the United States at the moment is extremely fevered. And obviously, there is a political dynamic. There's a domestic political dynamic. You make China the scapegoat for America's failure to deal with the virus outbreak. In fact, this part of the Pompeo's speech actually touches on this. It's all China's fault that, things have happened in the way that they have happened. And the fact that China dealt with the virus outbreak much more effectively than the US has done is another issue. But we must understand two things about this. Firstly, the drift towards confrontation with China has been happening for some time. Actually started under Barack Obama's administration. Obviously, it's hugely accelerated in the last few months, but the drift was already pointing that way. And the second is that there is no real discussion or dispute about it within the United States. There's a very, very strange article in the Financial Times making exactly that point and worrying about the fact.
I'm going to make the last observation here. I remember the first Cold War with the Soviet Union, and there was a real debate. Today, there is no real debate when it comes to China. That's all the time we have. I want to thank my guests in London. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time we make the CrossTalk.